I will convene the recess meeting of the Board of Commissioners from Wednesday, May 18th, 2022, and recognize Brian Matthews, Assistant County Manager, for the opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. This is the second day of our two-day workshop. Yesterday, there were some questions, and of course, we'll get to those just a little bit, but we had our financial advisor on until he had to leave the meeting for another engagement. He is back on today. We're going to have him go first. He's got some items he'd like to bring to the board's attention. Again, because he has another meeting he has to attend later in the day, so we want to be respectful of his time and allow him to be able to give some of his commentary on that. So it's I'll let Beverly introduce him and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners, Manager. We have online today our FA, Brent Robertson with Stifel. Yesterday there was a question asked about the difference in the ratings and what that would mean for an interest rate difference in savings or reduction. So he has put together some information to present to you all this morning, and we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, so I'm going to stand up here as he goes through these slides and move this slide forward for him. So Brent, you have the floor. Take it away.
Thanks, Beverly. Mr. Chair, members of council, my apologies for having to ring off yesterday. I did get a chance to sit through till about 11 o'clock, so I feel like I got a pretty good lead into the various topics y'all are considering, challenges before you. Beverly contacted me afterwards, and as she said, asked the question, what would it look like if the system were to be upgraded to AAA in terms of pricing on our bonds? And of course, you know, simple questions lots of times take a little bit more detail to explain. What I've done my best here in a handful of slides is try to condense down what goes into pricing a bond deal and ultimately what ends up resulting in the cost of funds that you all will pay. So the very first slide we're looking at, which is titled MMD. MMD it's the AAA general obligation tax exempt yield curve. It's the gold standard. This is the starting point for any tax exempt bond that gets sold in the public market. And so at least in theory, any general obligation bond selling in the market rated AAA should price right on top of the AAA yield curve. So from that sense, this is it's the first leg in the pricing stool when determining the cost of funds on any tax exempt transaction, including a revenue bond for the county's water and sewer system. In terms of where are we in interest rates with the gold standard, with the MMD, since the beginning of this year, you can see in this chart, what I've captured here is the 2-year, the 10-year, and 40-year MMD. We've had a pretty precipitous climb in interest rates at the beginning of the year, at least in the case of a 30-year bond, which was how the county amortized its 2021 bonds. We've literally seen the MMD double since the beginning of the year. So interest rates are going up, but the MMD, that's our starting point for determining interest rates. Beverly, if you could go to the next slide. So after taking a look at MMD and pricing the bond deal, we get into a discussion of credit spreads. And what are they? Credit spreads, what I'm calling here the next leg in the pricing stool, is the additional yield that investors are going to look for, in part driven by the rating on the bonds. So in the chart that I'm showing you here, you can see that the blue line is a BBB credit. Dark blue line at the bottom is a AA. And again, these are geo spreads. So what you see is that the lower your rating is, the higher your credit spread is, meaning the higher interest rate that you're going to pay. So as you can see from the beginning of 2022, we're starting to see those credit spreads creep back up again. And some of that has to do with market volatility. We're going to get into some of those other factors in just a little bit here that impact credit spread. But the takeaway from this page is, after you've talked about MMD, your gold standard, that's the starting point for your interest rate, then you had to have on top of it, what's your credit spread? Ratings are part of the impact. And that's the credit quality, but also credit type impacts your credit spread. So a general obligation bond, which is considered to be the strongest credit among muni investors, is going to have a smaller credit spread than a water and sewer revenue bond of the county. Even though they still might be rated AA, you're going to get a little bit more benefit, more aggressive pricing on a GO because it's considered to be more secure. Same token, a AA rated water and sewer bond is going to price a little bit stronger than a AA rated parking revenue bond because water and sewer is essential service. Parking is important. It's not essential like water and sewer. So credit dynamic, that second leg in the pricing stool. And Beverly, if you could move on to the next page. So the question that was put yesterday was, what if the county water and sewer system got to play? What would that look like? So in this chart, these are market closing as of yesterday. The second column is the MMD for yesterday. That's our gold standard. In the next two columns afterwards, you see what the yields would be in the market. And these are yield indexes, not an actual pricing on a deal, but the yield index for a AAA rated revenue bond. Under current market conditions as of yesterday, at least the perception among market participants was there is no credit spread. A AAA rated revenue bond, in theory, would have priced right on the rated GO bond. The next set of information is showing you the difference between a AAA revenue bond and a AA rated revenue bond, which is where we presently sit. That spread over MMD, and that's the last column we're looking at, on the long end of the curve is about 38 basis points or 0.4%. And of course, I'm sure this comes as no surprise that I've got a nice big caveat off to the right-hand side of the slide here that's saying these are estimates. Now, these are yield indexes that market participants use to gauge where they think the deal should price. But some of those other factors, I was talking about credit spread, rating certainly plays into your credit spread. Type of credit you have, a water and sewer versus a parking versus a GO, that plays into your credit spread. But other factors that play that credit spread, ultimately drive the funds. Overall market volume, volatility in the market, which we've got a lot of these days. Name recognition, a Union County, North Carolina, is probably going to price a little bit better than a small town in North Dakota, same rating, but you've never heard of it. Tax status, of course, has an impact on bonds. Whether or not you've got other deals out there that are comparable to yours that might draw away interest. Size of the transaction. Sometimes you'll hear underwriters talking about block sizes. When you've got a very large transaction that has $1 million plus in a given maturity, that's easier to sell than a one-off maturity of bonds of a few $100,000. Your redemption provisions that you're working in there, the more flexibility an issuer to redeem their securities early, the more it's going to cost you. Investors are going to extract additional yield, flexibility. Already talked about revenue play, and then use of proceeds. Again, a water and sewer bond issue going for an essential service is going to be perceived as a much stronger credit, a willingness of the board to raise rates and charges as necessary than if you were building a parking garage down the street. And that's, again, it may be important, it may assist in your economic drivers, but it's not essential. So all of these factors are going into, you see I've got this graphic at the bottom, it's not a three-leg stool for pricing your bonds, it's lots of legs that go into stool and you're pricing your bonds. So if you could flip to the next, Beverly, to get down to the math, taking those yields from yesterday, AAA rated revenue bond index versus the AA index. If the county were to hold $100 million of water and sewer revenue bonds yesterday and priced it similar to the way to the 2021 30-year level annual debt service, the difference, when assuming you priced right on top of those yield curves, comes out to about $240,000 a year, or $7.1 million over the life of the deal. And that's going to vary day to day. It's going to vary based on demand. Yesterday, at least, if you priced right on top of the yield curves, that's where the cost difference would have been. And then the last slide I prepared for y'all is, I assume this is probably maybe what came up during conversations yesterday. What are our odds of getting upgraded to a AAA? What I did is I went back to the credit reports from your last water and sewer deal, and those are from Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, and each one of those in their own way cites different credit commentary. Things that are strengths or weaknesses, factors that lead to an upgrade, In the case of S&P, they call it the upside and downside scenarios. My takeaway from this, and again, this is just my takeaway from reading these credit reports, having no discussions with your credit analysts. The challenge that the county is going to have is that there's a very large amount of debt that got issued in 2021, and the rating agencies were well aware of a bond issue that was programmed, at least back then, to be issued in 2024. But I think their concern is that, what does the additional debt burden look like on top of that afterwards? Will you be able to maintain sufficient debt service coverage? Because it was noted in the feasibility study, it was looking like it was going to trend down, at least at that time, below 2 times. Liquidity was also a big consideration in there. My gut reaction is, I think getting beyond where your ratings are right now is probably going to be something that you maybe need to be looking at as a long-term possibility. I don't think the odds on that are terribly strong, but at the same time, you're already sitting at incredibly strong ratings of AA2, AA plus from S&P, which is scratching right up against a AAA anyway, and AA from Fitch. Your water and sewer system is incredibly strong. But as you look at those factors on the back end, you can also look at the credit reports. Some of those factors may be outside your control. That's all I got. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions? Thank you, Brent, for your great explanation. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Andy Burnham with Stantec. We wanted to go through one other item that was part of the kind of formal prepared information to give to you today before we start going through some of the questions and responses that you posed yesterday, and then opening up for some discussion on some rate options. That being a discussion on system development fees and the update process. So just wanted to take about 10 to 15 minutes to go through that with you this morning to give you a sense of what we need to consider as we go through that process, because it is coming up, given the last study was done in April of 2018, and the requirement to do those every 5 years. So in that 2018 study, we really initiated that study in response to the passage of House Bill 436, which basically stipulated the requirements of what has to be done to impose system development fees. And at the time of that 2018 study, we worked with your existing asset base at the time, as well as the current capital improvement program that included a number of expansion-related projects that I've highlighted on the screen. It did include and contemplate the Yadkin expansion for the water supply system, the additional capacity from Monroe, the expansion of 12 Mile to 9 MGD, not all the way to 12, just to 9. And it did also contemplate a water reclamation facility for Lower Crooked Creek when that fee study was calculated. As I mentioned, 436 has really the governing legislation around how these fees need to be calculated in North Carolina. That legislation was passed in 2017, amended in 18. There were some further amendments actually in 21 as well. Some of the notable requirements for that House bill I've included here. Some things that are a little bit different are relative to just the public comment period that has to occur on changes to these fees. That is a little bit longer than what you would normally do for rates. It's a bit more formalized in terms of the process by which you receive those comments and respond to them in the report. And the other component that I've highlighted is just the planning horizon. So when you look at updating these fees, the legislation is pretty specific about making sure that you're contemplating a planning period of no shorter than 5 years, but no longer than 20 years in terms of growth development and capital projects that you might be including in the fees. So the 3 methods that are outlined in House Bill 436 are consistent with industry practice throughout the United States. The first method that's identified there is the buy-in method, and this is basically calculating the fees based upon your existing asset base. And in the North Carolina enabling legislation, there are restrictions or stipulations about how you can use the revenue from system development fees, depending upon the method that you're using to calculate them. And I think we've generally had conversations about that again, but it bears just repeating to make sure we're all on the same page about that. So under the buy-in method, those revenues can be used for reimbursement of existing capital improvement costs, as well as for rehabilitation costs, recognizing that the fee is based on existing assets that have already been built. Under the incremental cost method, this would be calculating fees solely based on your prospective capital improvement program, the expansion components of that capital improvement program. And so those revenues are first intended to be used for expansion-related projects as you complete them, and then second on any debt service that's been incurred for those expansion-related improvements. The third method is the combined method, which would be really a combination of your existing assets, that unit cost, plus the unit cost of your expansion portion of your capital improvement program. And the uses of those funds are very similar with the incremental method in terms of first looking to apply those to expansion-related projects and then to debt service for existing costs that you may have incurred. But also, because there is an existing asset component to it, one of the amendments to the initial legislation was that you can also use it for improvements for or to be reimburse existing improvement costs as well as for rehabilitation projects after you've looked at applying it for those first two purposes. So generally in the industry, we tend to look at these methods thinking about not just the use of revenues, but just what's the status of our system. If we have all the capacity built in our system to serve growth for the next few years, it tends to make sense to use the buy-in method because those existing assets are what's going to be used to serve growth. In the incremental method, it generally makes sense to use that when you're seeing much higher unit cost for additional water supplies and expansions that's going to be needed to serve new growth and development. And the combined method is generally used by utility systems that are have a little bit of both. They have some excess capacity in their existing assets or parts of their system, but they have to build more to serve growth over that same time period. So that's generally the rationale behind why you might choose one of the three methods. But I think in North Carolina, with that enabling legislation, the use of the revenues is also an important consideration here, as opposed to other states that don't have that type of prescriptive use of revenues depending upon the methodology that you pick. In North Carolina, there was a survey done shortly after the bill was passed just to identify what was the most common method being used. So this isn't a very comprehensive survey of all the systems in the state, but it's a decent survey. It's got about 60 systems in it. You can see about 2/3 of them were using the buy-in method. And I think, again, that goes in large part to the flexibility on the use of revenues that methodology entails. And then you can see that the next most common method was the combined, and a small portion were using the incremental method. So regardless of the method that you choose, the calculation is pretty straightforward. We need to take the value of the system, whether that's fixed assets, the existing system, the expansion portion of the capital improvement program, or the combination of those two. And then we have to deduct credits for outstanding debt that we've issued to pay for those same project costs, any grants that we've received to pay for some of those existing assets that we have, any contributions, including those that might be for some of the same capital improvement. So if there was, say, a rate adder or a special cost recovery mechanism for certain capital costs that are also included in the fee calculation, we have to give a credit for that. The whole point is to not double recover these capital costs from different funding sources. And then we take the value less those credits and divide it by the system capacity. And again, depending upon the methodology, that might just be your existing capacity if it's the buy-in method, or if it's also including your future expansion plans, the additional capacity that would be provided by those new improvements. So in addition to looking at how we calculate the unit rate for system development fees, we then also need to talk about how do we apply it. So many communities in North Carolina will use meter size to apply the system development fees. Some communities will use estimates of demand based on maybe number of seats in a restaurant or square feet in a commercial office building, or they'll have fixture unit counts that they'll use as a basis of the fees. Those are a little bit more data intensive and require you to go beyond the normal data collection that you would normally do in terms of having information about the number and size of meter installs. So this is a pretty good reflection of what we see across the country in terms of most systems will use meter size because it's working with data that's pretty readily available, and it's a good measure of the potential capacities of new customers as they connect to the system. So your current fee schedule I've put up here on the screen. Union County does use meter size to scale and apply the water as well as wastewater system development fees. The analysis, as I mentioned, was done that supports these fees in April of 2018. The methodology was adopted. Fees were ultimately approved to be updated in November of 2019 and implemented in February of 20. And really what's in place today reflects fundamentally the combined method that was a result of that 2018 study. So one of the things when we start to look at the surveys of other utilities, the methodology is important to consider. You know, for many utilities that are using the buy-in method, that's based on existing asset costs that were built several years ago. So they have a lower unit cost typically. So we need to keep that in mind when we look at surveys, as well as the fact that not necessarily all utilities will adopt full cost recovery fees. In fact, from that same survey by the Environmental Finance Center, about 2/3 did adopt the full cost recovery fee that was identified in their system development fee studies, but about 1/3 did not. So the methodology and those cost recovery practices are going to also influence how you see comparative results on these surveys. So we need to keep that in mind as we look to comparing Union County's fees against others. The methodology and cost recovery are going to be key differences as to why we might see some entities with different fees. So policy comes into play here is really what I'm saying. So communities that want to maximize these fees from a revenue source are going to look to use, you know, a higher cost methodology and also have a higher cost recovery in the basis of their fees.
Quick question.
Sure.
Does the depreciation method you use for valuing the utility systems, does that differ from the depreciation method we use in managing our finances for water and sewer?
So typically we'll want to start with those accounting useful lives that are in the fixed asset register, and only in certain cases would we make exceptions to that if we're seeing significant differences in the functional useful lives of the assets. So if they're significantly exceeding those useful lives, we might want to make modifications to those schedules to make sure that those assets that are still in service today, even though they might be fully depreciated from an accounting perspective, are still being captured in the fee. So that's a kind of a case-by-case designation, but for the study we did before, we stuck with what was in the accounting system.
Okay,
So.
gotcha.
And so this is a survey of 2022 water system development fees for a typical residential connection. Think about that 3/4 inch meter size. And so I've highlighted where Union County sits on this survey for the water systems. Again, we utilized the combined method and went to full cost recovery. I don't have information with me today about the methodology and cost recovery that was used for these other agencies. We would need to do a fair amount of research to try to get that. It's normally not part of the published fee schedule. For wastewater, I've also identified for the same entities what the current sewer system development fees are, and you can see Union County has, again, one of the higher system development fees, again, notwithstanding the differences that may exist in cost recovery or the methodologies that are used as part of this process. And then when you combine the two, just adding the blue bar for water and the green bar for sewer, you can again see comparatively where we stand on those system development fees. As vis-a-vis several of the other utility systems that we've identified here. So as we go forward and look to do the update of these fees for fiscal 23, because that'll be within the 5-year requirements of the state statutes to update these every 5 years, you know, we do need to keep in mind that we base those current fees on the combined methodology, which was based on our fixed assets at the time in 2018, and the then current capital improvement program, which is, I think, a very important thing to keep in mind, because as we have all these conversations about the capital improvement program and what we do include in it or not, that feeds directly into the system development fee evaluation. And so we need to have those things be very consistent. So just keep that in mind as you consider your options for capital improvement funding and what you include in the rate plan. That's also what we would be looking to include as the basis of the system development fees, because we need to have that consistency in terms of the projects that we include. And so that'll be a key point to consider as we get into the discussions. And also that may impact the methodology that we use. So thinking about, say, Yadkin, for instance, that project is now going to be complete or fundamentally complete. You know, for the water system, it may make sense to look at the buy-in method as opposed to the combined method, because now that's part of our fixed asset base. And it would give us more flexibility on the revenues, but the fee may not necessarily have to be reduced as a result, because it's now going to be a fixed asset. So we may be able to find some opportunities to gain flexibility as part of the process, but that capital improvement cost that goes into the fee is going to be very important to consider. When we looked at this in 2018 versus 23, you know, we just wanted to do a kind of a high-level reconciliation for some of the major projects for you about what we had in the 2018 expansion-related capital improvements for the 2018 study, which is on the table on the left, and then where we are in 2023. So as I mentioned, Yadkin is going to be fundamentally complete by the time we complete that system development fee study update. You can see what we had in the prior study for Monroe is pretty similar, except now we'll be taking that capital cost out and putting it as an operating expense, as we talked about yesterday. So that really wouldn't go into the basis of the capital improvements for a system development fee. So that would be a notable change. For wastewater, we did have the 12 Mile Creek expansion in the 2018 study. It's a little bit more costly today for a lot of the reasons we talked about yesterday in terms of the construction cost inflation that we've seen. But the prior study did not contemplate or include an allowance for expanding it from 9 MGD to 12. So that would be a potential change. And then similarly for the plant for Lower Crooked Creek, the prior study included an allowance that's obviously much different today, depending upon the size of the facility. It's bigger than what was contemplated in the prior 2018 study, as well as the magnitude of the expenses are certainly larger. So just some trade-offs that I wanted to make sure that you're all aware of to hammer home that point of the choices we make on capital are definitely going to have a bearing on the system development fee study, both the methodology that we choose and ultimately the resulting fees. I think that's really the important takeaways I wanted to leave you with. So. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions on system development fees in particular for now, and then I think when we're completed with this, the intent is to go back to some of the questions from yesterday and provide some answers on those.
We had talked about, or I know Brian and I had a discussion before about the rates, like the rates on our consumers could affect that system development fee, where the system development fee would be lowered with higher rates. So you raise the rates, the system development fee lowers. Is that correct?
So I want to make sure that Andy understands what we're talking about. So if the board were to consider a capital component of your rates, if you were to do a rate that had a capital recovery component to it, then that would certainly have an effect on your system development fees, because you could not double charge a customer a system development fee as well as a capital rate charge for that. And that was what we were talking about.
The double charge. So like if
Yeah.
we just built into our rate that capital charge.
It may lower the system development fee for new development, and that's the key here is, you know, when you're the credits that I think that Andy is talking about, you have to take into consideration how you collect revenue versus also how you pay for future capital.
And another thing, when we have increase in cost, unknown increases in cost, but we've already set the system development fee for the anticipated costs. So let's just say that we anticipate the cost is going to be $100 million, and it goes to $150 million. Is there anything built into that if the rates or the costs increase, that system development fee covers it and it's not put on the backs of the ratepayers?
Yeah, I think I'll have to go back and check the specific language in the bill, but my recollection as I stand here today is that there's not anything that precludes you from doing updates any earlier than 5 years. It's a requirement that you update them no less frequently than every 5 years. So if something changes and you needed to do an update to the fees to account for those types of changes, I think you could do that, but you would have to follow the public notice and comment process identified in the legislation. I don't think there's a way that you can have a mechanism that would automatically adjust for those things. I think you'd have to have another study done that takes that into account and follow those comment and notice procedures to do that. So, but that'll be something that we'd probably want to research with your legal team to find out just what the ability would be to try to build a mechanism like that. But I just don't think that's permissible, but it's worth double checking.
Yeah, because, you know, when we had the Yadkin project and it came in, we went from 200 to 300 million, and then our ratepayers had to come up with the money to help, you know, pay for that. And so we could, before the 5 years, do another, you know, if something like that, if a project came, how long would it take to do that? Just a rough idea.
The studies are pretty quick, so because of the fixed asset process and capital improvement program, so conducting the actual study is probably about a 90-day process, and then you have to follow those notice requirements. I mean, you're probably all in no more than 6 months to do something like that.
So instead of raising rates, we could just do another study to see if that wouldn't, because if we do raise the rates again, it goes back to we're lowering the system development fee.
I think it depends on how you would raise those rates. So if I heard Brian right, if you were to do, say, a specific like adder to your rates for capital projects in a particular area, that's the sort of thing that we would have to come back and give a present value credit in the system development fee calculation. But if you were just to raise rates organically to cover your capital cost and do normal rate adjustments, those sorts of things we wouldn't necessarily have to give back as a specific credit. It's really if you do things that are specific for certain capital projects as a specific rate addition, that's what kind of triggers that credit mechanism in the system development fees.
And it still figures into the basin, so this has to be charged in the basin that it benefits, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday. Do these, if we charge something in the Yadkin or Rocky River Basin versus charging something in the Catawba Basin, is there any, we use the same, so I'm a little bit confused too, that how that works. There is no separation of basins, or there is?
So the system development fees that we collect are for the entire system.
Right.
That's how it's structured. There is no mandate that we actually separate those and spend those by basin. We have chosen to do that by basin because we think that is more appropriate as far as how our system should be accounted for. So when we collect fees in the Crooked Creek Basin, we allocate those fees for debt as well as the cost within Crooked Creek, and the same thing for 12 Mile. But there is no mandate that we have to do it that way because we've treated it as a system as a whole.
Okay, yeah, good. So it's just this is a policy, not a requirement.
That's correct.
Exactly, yep.
Okay.
Now, if the board, and I'm not suggesting you do this, but if the board were to say, we actually want to do a study specific per basin, and you might have multiple studies, you may have a system development fee study for the 12 Mile Creek, and you say that is what is specific to 12 Mile, and a system development fee study for Crooked Creek. That may be possible. We've never had that discussion.
Yeah, and that would require some allocations of a lot of your existing assets to be able to support
Right,
that.
but our
So,
system
yeah.
really is one system. I mean.
That's correct.
I mean, whether we use water, right now we're using water in both systems, both basins, and we have, we're using sewer from one basin to another, so it is a.
It's
it
more
is-
complicated if we were to try to really
Right.
segregate it that
Right.
way, but it's easier for us to account for it by knowing what we have within each basin, and that's just the easiest way for us to do it. We think it's the better way to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Question. All this sounds great. I understand that if we can get these system development fees raised, it will certainly take it off the ratepayers. And let's say we could get the system development fee to $15,000 per lot. But we still can't borrow money on the bond market based on what we're going to collect in the future, can we?
So when we do the analysis for the debt issuances, we have to do those debt coverage calculations that we talked about yesterday. And two of those are forward-looking. So when we do the financial feasibility reports and the projections and we forecast out the net revenues of the system, those do include system development fee revenues. So when we do those debt coverage calculations to measure the adequacy of our revenues to meet those principal and interest payments, we do get to include those system development fee revenues in that forecast. And similarly, when we do the additional bonds test, when we can issue debt, when we do that net revenue analysis, it does include system development fees as part of that coverage calculation.
How do you predict the recession?
Well, so that's where if I could do that, I would be probably somewhere on a beach with my feet propped up with a drink with an umbrella in it. We do the best we can to try to project circumstances and update those forecasts.
But if you don't anticipate it, and we build the plant, and then everything just shuts down or an economic almost collapse, we've still got to make those payments.
That's right. That's why we designed the rates and the forecast with those buffers that I mentioned yesterday on those minimum debt service requirements. So that way, if we do have some of those economic downturns, impacts from, say, a natural disaster, emergency situations, drought conditions where we have to implement mandatory water use restrictions that pull our revenues down, we have the ability to withstand those impacts and still meet those minimum bond requirements.
But that, to me, it's just not sound financial guidance to say Union County is going to continue to grow. And the thing about it, system development fees, if we get them increased in the Yadkin Valley, is not going to happen for 6 to 8 years.
Yeah, I think your points are well taken, and that's why in the forecasting, we want to make sure that we can still have adequate coverage of debt with rates by themselves so that we're not wholly relying on system development fees, but we leverage them to the extent we can in our forecast to show we're going to have adequate resources to help repay the debt and to help provide that confidence to the investment community. But from a planning purpose, we want to make sure that we're always covering that with just our rates themselves in an abundance of caution. So that's again why we have those buffers on the coverage to make sure that we're going to be okay if there is, another recession, or when there is another recession, or if customer usage profiles change and usage comes way down and we have those types of impacts to our revenue streams, that we can still meet our covenants and our requirements.
Hey, Andy, this is Brent. Do you mind if I jump in real quick?
Go right ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, something else to remember too, notwithstanding the fact that the bond ordinance or the bond documents allow for the inclusion of the system development fees, when the rating agencies are looking at the sustainability or the viability of the system from a financial standpoint, they're going to run the coverage in two ways. They're going to look at how debt service coverage plays out, of course, with every revenue that is legally allowed to be included in the definition. But they're also going to strip out those system development fees for the very purpose, or for the very we're talking about now, the what if scenario. What if projections don't play out because of a economic downturn or recession? So I think this is an important consideration for the board, that even though we can include those revenues from a legal standpoint, the credit metric are going to strip them out and look at those without them in there. So I just want to point that out real quick.
Well, that's what I was,
Yep.
that's what I was wanting to be said, that they're going to be stripped out in the final analysis. And when we did the Yadkin, we also increased system development fees. And at that point, developers on any size development had to pay, they did their system development fee in payments, like phases. And then the General Assembly went and changed it, and you only have to pay when you pull a permit.
Yep.
So conceivably, we could build a plant for 5,000 houses or 10,000 houses and plug those system development fees in, and then we have a catastrophic economic setback, and then that doesn't happen. So it'll fall back on the ratepayers. And to me, that makes sense to do little incrementals instead of betting on what we hope to come, because we've been so blessed in this county. We've dodged so many bullets. But
Yeah, and I think to say what I think I'm hearing from you a little bit differently, I think, there's an opportunity to potentially leverage system development fees to the extent you can as an offset, right? So it's not what you're relying on to cover the fundamental expenses, but they can be an offset to those expenses in a way that you can maximize the amount of revenue you can capture from growth to cover them. But rates are the fundamental resource that are ultimately going to be that backstop and that foundation of how you're going to show the repayment plan. And system development fees are a way to try to optimize how you can recover costs from growth, but they are variable.
well, my ultimate goal is to have the lowest utility rates, but still have the reserves that where we go to the market, we can get the best rate out there.
Yep.
And you can't have both. You just, you can't borrow money cheap and have rock bottom rates.
No, you have to take care of the system and deal with some of the items we spoke of yesterday, the renewal and replacement, operational cost inflation, regulatory requirements, and those things unfortunately increase from year to year. So we have to deal with that, and then the growth dynamic. So it's a very untenable position to try to do all that without rate adjustments.
And I'm glad you're standing here today with a county that's in our financial condition instead of another county where you'd be trying to figure out how we gonna do it and can we afford to pay for it.
Yeah, your financial strength is definitely an asset in these types of
I'm on
conversations.
county water alone. My water bill for me and my wife is $25 a month. That is cheap. Okay. Yes, sir.
And those concerns, some of the concerns you were talking about, in 2006, that's, where we were looking at building a new sewer plant. We were being requested to build a new sewer plant, and the economy did go south. In 2007 and 8, everything kind of hit. It was almost like a perfect storm. You had the economy going down, you had all the problems that we were going through, you had no sewer, So if we would have had built that plant, you know, we would have been going through that scenario that you just talked about, and at the end of the day, it was my understanding, what I was told back then by staff, is at the end of the day, if nobody's paying the payments on that sewer plant, if the ratepayers are not paying it and the development fees or impact fees then were not paying it, we would have, taxpayers would ultimately be on the hook for that money.
Yeah, you would have been in default if you couldn't
Yeah.
make your payments.
And the tax rate would have had to cover those payments. And so, you know, the recession is going to create a whole lot more problems than just that. If you have the timing of the fee, Brian, the timing of the collection of the fee is also an issue we talked about. So if we collect the fees half upfront or upfront or in some other form, that would be something we would have to get legislation to do, correct?
That's correct, yes, sir. So currently, the method for collection is that it's at building permit. It previously was we collected those funds up front. Of course, that's changed. And so if the General Assembly were to consider a change to that, that would certainly be a positive for us. But right now, we have to count on those funds coming in trickle amounts over time. So we don't get them in large chunks.
And we have some developments that are, you just take their time about building, right? I mean, there's some that build fairly quickly at a steady pace, and then some don't, right?
That they vary. Some build out within the matter of 2 or 3 years. Some may take 5 to 7 years to build out. It really depends on the project.
Okay, thank you.
But I would say to that, Commissioner Rushing, the bigger developments, they don't play around. They build fast, they put children in schools, and you've got facility issues quicker than you can build those facilities. Anybody that takes 5 to 7 years, and we'll be talking about this later on May 31st, if you take 5 years to build out a subdivision, you're losing money versus 2 or 3, because the clock starts ticking when they close on the land.
I have a clarification that I think that one of the things that we need to make sure the board is aware of in working with our legal staff in going through the general statutes, we've identified that the definition of new development is not what we've thought it to be. New development actually is once you've adopted a system development fee ordinance or study, at that date, anything that is actually built after that date is not considered new development. Those projects would have to actually pay a system development fee. So anything prior to 2018, when the board adopted your system development fee ordinance, those homes would be exempt from a system development fee. However, anything built after that date does not qualify for an exemption from a system development fee. So a home built in 2020 on a well, if they were to connect to the county water system at some later date, they would pay a system development fee. And that is something that we have not really explained, because honestly it was not clear to us that that is a provision of the statutes as how new development is defined. So I want to make sure that everyone does understand that when we're going through these short line programs, if there is a home out there that is after 2018, they will be required to pay a system development fee.
Built after 2.
Built after 2018, after July 2018, when we formally adopted the actual system development fee study.
What, Brian, there's a lot of these older houses. What do they pay if they were built in 70?
So there is no system development fee if you were built prior to that.
So they just
You
pay-
would pay your tap fees. You would pay if the board had, you know, as we do with the short line program, if you've identified that there's a contribution that they need to make, they would pay that contribution as well as the tap fee, but they would not pay a system development fee.
All
Now,
right.
vacant property is different. Vacant property will have to pay a system development fee.
Can we follow up with the lady that spoke Monday night in public comments? I mean, you know, the one that's got the well and can't afford to pay the
We
system.
are, and I do want to stress that, you know, we did have this conversation with the board about the concern. obviously, we're not a financial institution. We don't want to get in the business of loaning money. Can we offer some opportunity for maybe a little bit of a time period to pay that? Certainly, we can discuss that and bring that back to the board. But what I don't want us to get into a situation of we're loaning people money. We're just not, that's not our position.
You missed my point. Was her house built before 2018?
That I don't know.
That's
I'm
what we
sorry,
need to follow up on.
Yes, we will certainly check on that.
But had a lady that was approved under short line and was having trouble coming up with her system development fee because her well's bad.
I think she was actually having trouble with the contribution. Remember, the board established that there's a contribution that
Right.
Applicants must pay, and it's based on participation. So the more people you have, the lower the contribution, the
Okay.
less. I think that was her concern.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
you're
And
right.
we'll certainly verify that.
Thank you. This board is famous for, or I am, for running rabbits every once in a while. We'll be going down the path and get distracted and.
That's very good. Okay.
You see full slides, you see May for Recession Part 4, Part 3. Good morning again, Commissioners. We're a little bit ahead of where we are in the slides because of just the order of things that we're doing. You already heard from the financial advisor. You just got the system development fee update. And I just wanted to go over one thing before Brian comes up and sort of takes you through some of the follow-up items from yesterday. And then Andy's going to come back and sort of present to you some more scenario information that they put together yesterday afternoon based on the conversations that you all had. And then I think Brian's going to lead you through, well, he's going to facilitate the discussion to try to get you all to a point where we can get some direction from all of you. What's being handed out right now is the sort of this overview PowerPoint so that you have a complete set of documents in your binder. I believe the clerk also has just a one-page handout, which is what I wanted to talk to you about real quick, which is the miscellaneous fees. So we talked about it yesterday real quick. Sort of the majority of our revenue comes from customer charges. We also have miscellaneous fees that we charge for a variety of services that we provide to customers. And we talked to you about it last year because as part of the cost of service update that Stantec did, they looked at our miscellaneous fees and they essentially said that our fees are out of date. They do not cover the cost of service, and we haven't looked at them in a very long time. And so we recommended to the board last year that we update the fees over a 2-year period of time. So what the board approved last year was a 50% increase in our fees between where we were and where Stantec said was our cost of service. So we went halfway, and I just wanted to bring this before you as part of the decision-making that you are going to have to do as part of the budget, that we are going to be presenting to you the rest of the increase to go to cost of service for our miscellaneous fees. So they were effective October 1, 2021, which was part of the rate ordinance. And in FY23, we're going to propose the second half, and we're asking for the effective date on that to be September 1, 2022, so that when the budget is approved, that we'll have plenty of time to give adequate notice to our customers and future customers that the fees schedule is changing, so that they'll have the opportunity to, if they wanted to take advantage of that 2-month window, to get in before the fees change. And so what you have before you in the one-page handout is the proposed schedule of miscellaneous fees. They go, one fee that we haven't changed is the account setup fee. That's been $25 for as long as I've been here and even before that, and that stays the same. But you can see, just going through the 2 columns on the right, what the adjustment was to last year. So the FY22 approved fee is the current rate schedule cost for these services. And then what we are asking and what we will be bringing before you is the FY23 proposed fee, which again takes us to 100% cost recovery based on the study that was done in 2019 by Stantec. So you can see, for instance, the delinquency fee would increase from $95 to $140. Depending on the size of the meter install, some of the costs are changing there as well. And you can just go through, and I don't think it'd be a good use of your time for me to read through every fee on this list, but I just wanted to make sure that you had it and are aware of it. And if you have any questions, we are here, staff are here to answer any questions that you have, either today or, obviously prior to the board adopting the budget. If there are no questions, I'll just ask Brian to come on up.
All right. And again, that is for information. We will obviously be asking the board to make decisions on these items in the future, but honestly, we want to know if your support for that, because that will have to be wrapped up into changes for the budget. So that's why we're giving it to you for information. The board asked some questions yesterday. We wanted to follow up with those questions, and also there's some clarifications we need to make and some corrections as well. So I thought we'd kind of start with number one. The board had asked about water and sewer customers, and so previously you heard from Andy Neff about 58,000. He was actually talking about connections, not customers, because there's a difference between what connections are versus what customers are. Irrigation, fire connections, those are connections. They're not necessarily customers. So from a customer standpoint, we actually have 55,264 customers. We have 58,000 plus connections. So I don't want there to be any confusion on that, because there is a difference between connections versus customers. And in doing the lead and copper study, we're actually required to go out and inventory our connections, not necessarily customers. So I wanted that to be clear. As you can see from what we have here, we do have over 55,000 customers. Water only makes up shy of 14,000 customers. The bulk of our customers are water and sewer combined customers. They make up over 41,000 customers for our system. But as a whole, 55,264 total customers. And any questions about that particular item? And that's what I talked about as far as connections go. That just gives you some details on what we consider as a connection versus a customer. So the next question had to do with what were the cost savings potential for Poplan and Fieldstone pump stations. What you have here is the yearly and the monthly and the yearly utility costs for the Poplan pump station. The Fieldstone pump station, the actual homeowner association pays for that electricity bill for that. Poplan is paid by the county. So it's roughly almost $50,000 in utility costs. Now, what that does not take into consideration is any of our future maintenance costs. I can't tell you what those are going to be, because honestly it depends on if you have to replace a pump, what do you have to do. So we can't give you that information because we just don't know it. We do know that pumps don't last forever. We do know there are maintenance costs, but so if you take a pump offline, then we no longer have those costs that we have to incur. But strictly from a known number, we're going to save about $50,000 a year if we do not have the utility costs for the Poplan pump station. Same thing when it goes to our field staff. While we send our field staff out to go and inspect these facilities, if they're no longer having to inspect that facility, it doesn't mean that we're losing a field staff member. We're just repurposing them. They're doing something else with that time. So that's, again, difficult to give you a cost savings for that. This is the easiest thing we can show you for that. Any questions about that particular item?
Yes, I have a question for Commissioner Rushing, and I'm sincere. What was the purpose of knowing the amount of power at Poplan?
And this goes to my question. The other pump stations that we're doing, now that's a large pump station.
That is, yes, sir.
And that's one of probably the biggest that we
I
have.
would say that's one of the largest, yes,
Yeah.
sir.
So, and you said that Fieldstone, their homeowners association pays their utility bill on their pump station. What about the others? How many pay their own utility bills versus how many do we pay?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I suspect there's some who do that, but I would not say that all of them do that.
Do you know how that gets figured out? Because, let's say that I walk into Public Works and I need a pump station, and I negotiate that I need a pump station, and in the past, Public Works would determine that, yes, I could get that pump station. Do we negotiate that and say, okay, well, the homeowner association will have to pay the electric bill, or we'll pay the electric bill? How did that happen before, do you know?
And again, I'm going to tell you in what I think it is, not what I know, because I've not explored that exact question. Understand that when a pump station serves more than one community, it's not appropriate to ask for one community to pay that.
Right.
So my expectation is what's happened is when a pump station truly only serves one development, at that point in time, we do ask the development to pay that cost. I don't know if that's an ordinance requirement, if that's a negotiated item. I don't know the answer to that. We can certainly research that and get that for you. But my expectation is it's based on it only serves a small number of homes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Rushing, I would point out that our recent action on pump stations, this is what we were after, coming up with a system-based methodology where a gravity has no cost, and we're trying to take these costs off of the backs of the ratepayers and put them on the actual developer that creates the need for it.
And certainly, if it's not within our ordinance, and I can't say that it is or isn't in the ordinance, but if it is not within our ordinance, that the utility cost for a pump station that only serves a development, then we can certainly make that a requirement. I don't see why we cannot make that a requirement if it is not a requirement.
Well,
Understanding, though, that it really needs to be specific to it only serves these customers and they're the ones paying that.
But the whole point here is, we've already started down this path of trying to isolate outlying costs and make the people that are creating these outlying costs pay for it instead of the whole system customer base.
Yes, sir. And one of the things that I know the board has asked us to look into are life cycle costs, how that plays into the future of operation and maintenance. And we are looking into that, and we'll bring you back some information on life cycle costs as well.
Mr. Chairman. Brian, when you say you don't, I can understand that electricity is easy, but I would assume that you have a manpower planning that pump stations create a demand on your staff.
Certainly, yes, sir.
They go once a year. So I'd appreciate if you could, give me an idea on that cost. I mean, there's a cost associated going out once a week. I mean, your vehicle, everything.
Certainly.
So there's got to be some kind of associated cost when we have to make a determination whether a pump station's viable and what the actual cost will be.
We will try to get you what we would consider to be a unified costs, because it's going to depend on the pump station. The more complicated the pump station, the more time we have to spend
Well, I
on that.
understand.
So what we can do is at least give you a unit cost and say, this is the proposed unit cost. Understand that changes based on the complexity of the pump station we're dealing with.
And the cost associated.
Yes, sir.
So, okay, thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
And, just doing a quick calculation, as, approximate numbers, that looks like it would serve about 7,000 homes.
I don't know the number that it actually serves.
But
I
roughly-
can't say that.
Roughly 7,280 gallons per
Okay.
home, about 58 cent a day, or 58 cent a month on the bill would be
For
for
the
just
uti-
electricity, yeah.
If it were to be charged to the individuals, it's charged to the homeowner association, but if it were to be charged to the individuals.
Yeah. So, and that was just curious, because that is probably one of our biggest electricity users.
I would say you're correct, yes, sir.
And now, do we have some kind of monitoring on these pump stations like this one, like,
We have a SCADA system, so our
Yeah.
SCADA system actually alerts us if there's any issues going on. Obviously, we want to put eyes on it, that's why we go at least once a week.
Isn't
You
that a
don't
state
wanna-
requirement once a week?
Andy, is that a state requirement? Okay, so that is a state requirement.
I originally was told not by our department, but it was 2 times a week.
Again, I think it depends on our pump stations. So if it's a very complex pump station, we may be spending more than 2 days looking at it. If it's one that's relatively minor, we may only visit it once a week.
And the whole goal here is not to look down on pump stations, but to establish their true cost. Because I know when I first went on the commission and sat in an agenda meeting, it seemed like every time I turned around, there was a budget request for refurbishing a pump station. And I got to thinking, well, how many gravity flow systems have we had to refurbish? None.
Right. And I think you said this before, Chairman, and I think it's important that, first off, the board took the step of adopting your service areas. That's the first step. So you have sewer service areas. The next step is, as part of our master planning process, is to figure what do you want to serve within those areas. There will be some areas within that we may still not serve, and that's okay. But there will be other areas you may identify that you want to serve. Some of those cannot be served by gravity. They just can't. So again, if the board assumes that you want to serve an area and it cannot be served by gravity, then we'll have to have a plan for how do we accomplish that and how do we pay for that. So you've taken the first step. Second step is our master plan. What do we do with that and how do we move forward from there?
Well, I think it can be said, we want to serve everybody, but we want everybody to pay their fair share of the part of what it's costing us to maintain it for perpetuity.
I understand. Yes, sir.
Stoney.
Mr. Chairman. And just for the other board members that you may know of the story on this, this pump station particularly has a little bit of a history that it was a vision in the shower.
Okay.
That's how it started. This pump station, one of our employees at Public Works had a vision in the shower of how to serve that area and push it to the 12 Mile Creek. And in doing that, it also helps us with our interbasin transfer, managing that flow.
It does.
That if we go over our 5 million gallon interbasin transfer, then we could put up to 2 million gallons back and
Manage that
That was
IBT.
part of it as well. So that, that's just the history of this for like,
Yes, sir.
That might be a vision I can't get out of my head.
well, I didn't say who was in the shower, but it was.
Make sure you don't identify that employee.
So the next thing, and I'm going to go back to some other questions, but the next thing I want to do is I want to make a correction. So yesterday, Commissioner Rushing asked a question or brought up that his recollection was about what was included in the scenarios presented in 2019. And he was actually correct. In 2019, Scenario 3, which shows that 15.5% rate increases with 2.5%, someone in the future, did include the Lower Crooked Creek original project. Now, I'll make some clarifications about that in a minute, but it did include that in that item. Scenarios 1 and 2 did not include that. And that was my recollection. I knew we showed you ones without that being included, but it's scenarios 1 and 2 that actually did not include the Lower Crooked Creek plant. Now, what I want to point out here is you see that those numbers are higher, and you might ask, well, why is that higher? Obviously, we have a higher expense that we're having to accommodate. Why is the rate higher for scenario 1 in future years versus the rate in scenario 3? Staff reminded me that by having a wastewater treatment plant, you're adding capacity. By adding capacity, you can grow your customer base faster. If you don't have capacity, then your customer base is going to grow slower because you're serving more lower density development, so you're not going to grow your system as fast. So therefore, you can't spread your cost out among more customers. So your rates have to increase based on the fact that you're growing your system at a slower rate. That's why the rate on scenario 1 is higher than the rate on scenario 2. So I wanted to make that clarification. I do want to point out that the original cost estimate that was done for 2019 was based on the 2016 master plan, which was a much smaller plant. It was a 4 MGD plant to start with. It did not include taking Crooked Creek plant offline and sending the flow to that plant. Crooked Creek was going to stay in place for a number of years, so that was not anticipated within that cost estimate. And that total cost estimate, which was reevaluated in 2019, was $122 million. A lot less than the estimated $276 million if you were to do Site B today. That is the current high estimate for that project. So I did want to make that clarification. It did include it, but it was the original estimates from 2016 and then updated in 2019.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
And it seemed to me, I remember, Mark, I think we talked about this, that did not include the piping from that section. So that was a lower estimate.
Yes,
But
that's correct.
it also didn't include getting it from the Indian Trail area to that plant.
It did not include the Crooked Creek pipe. Yeah, it did not decommission Crooked Creek, and it did not run the flow from Crooked Creek to the new plant. That was not included in that. And it was also a smaller plant as well.
Brian, my understanding after visiting Crooked Creek, its life expectancy is very limited.
Yes, sir. So I was having this conversation with Andy yesterday and Bart Farmer, who helps run our treatment plants, and understand that plant, we are squeaking all out of it that we can. I can't tell you is it going to last for 10 years or 20 years more, but what we do know is that there's going to come a point in time where we're going to have to invest a lot of money to either redo that plant, or we're going to have to invest a lot of money in doing some other plant, because it will not operate forever. The technology in it is starting to, to have to be replaced. We're having to fabricate things to put in there because you cannot find those parts any longer. And he pointed out, and I didn't even think about this, some of the concrete in there is actually disintegrating, and you cannot find good concrete to make your connections to. So there will be a point. So 10 years, 20 years, don't know the answer to that. We're going to have to sink a lot of money into either new or a complete rehab of that plant.
What was explained to me, your controls and electrical systems, you talk about fabricating.
Yes, sir.
That could drive the plant to its demise quicker than the concrete failing.
Yeah, I believe some of our electrical switches don't exist anymore. We're having to find those on eBay and some of the other places because they just don't have them. And that we may very well have to redo the whole electrical component of that plant. Understanding that we try to plan for these plants going out of service, but the board's decision may have to push those plans out, and we recognize that. But when you make decisions, we have to then be nimble enough to figure out how can we make these things last longer than we expected them to last. So you're right. The piper is going to be paid at some point in time. I just can't tell you when the piper has to be paid.
Brian, if I could interrupt. One other factor, that plant is landlocked on a very small parcel of land. There is no expanding that plant. Even if you wanted to, if it had to be taken offline and part of it go through a demolition and then rebuilt, you still, that, I don't know how we would do that. It would have to be, the effluent would have to be pumped somewhere to be treated. And there's not piping to do that currently in place.
No, and I will point out, and John's probably going to shoot me over this, but part of what he showed you earlier was the pumps for Crooked Creek, which is the bypass pumps, the diversion pumps. That may very well be the solution for how we have to move flow while we basically tear down that existing plant and rebuild a plant. If that's your decision, we're not advocating that that's what you do, But if you decide that we're not going to build a new treatment plant somewhere else, we may very well have to figure out how we tear that plant down, move that flow to 12 Mile Creek while we tear that plant down and rebuild that plant on that site. But I understand that plant will not last forever. We will have to do something. Yes, sir.
And that's one of the issues that I'm concerned with Public Works. And none of y'all in particular, not saying anything about any of the, it's not about current staff. You know, there's a lot of things that seem not to be figured in at the time that we're building things, is like the useful life of this plant. When I put a septic tank in the ground, I'm figuring there's a useful life on that septic tank, or I may have to have it pumped out, or I may have to have some repairs done on it, but I'm not taking it out. The life of my house is the life of that septic tank. Versus these plants, you know, and I keep hearing obsolete technology, parts that we have to remake or whatever, and that's concerning. That, you know, what is the life of this plant? When was it originally constructed?
Sure, in I believe 1980s, 1986 maybe, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken. Andy can correct me if I'm wrong.
And
I do, go ahead, yes, sir, I'm sorry.
And so we didn't
So
build into the cost of it that it would have to be replaced?
So
or-
I want to point out that there actually has been a plan in place for what to do with that plant. The board has just not given us direction to move forward with that plan. It was always intended that a new wastewater treatment plant would be the reason to take that plant offline. It was intended that that plant would be closer to its useful life, and that your 2016 master plan identified how to take that offline, how to then accommodate that sewer flow. So I want you to understand, we do think about those things, but board decisions impact that. So when the board decides to move out a project or not do a project, how we intended on accommodating that has to change. Currently, we don't know what the board's decision is with a new plant. So we have to continue to operate that plant for as long as we can operate it.
And Brian, I would say this, that it's not only the board decisions that affect that. We're limited by what the state will allow us to do.
Certainly.
We're even limited by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, what we're able to do. There are a lot of agencies and regulatory agencies that have a say in what we do with those creeks and what we put into those creeks. And I would go back to 2004, 2005, 2006, when U.S. Fish and Wildlife said there's a hill splitter mussel in the creeks, and not that we don't want you putting the water there, that the water's not killing the hill splitter. What they were worried about was the sediment from the continued construction and the rooftops that was going into that creek, and that's what they didn't want. And so they held that over our heads for a long time and delayed and stop, you know, they could stop things as well. So it's not just us. So I really do, as somebody with a septic tank, if my septic tank fails, I'm done. I'm just done. So
Well, what you have is in today's, for a septic tank, there is a repair area for it, but you're correct.
Right.
I mean, ultimately, we can only plan for what's known.
Right.
And obviously, we do try to take into consideration the timing it takes to go through permitting and whether or not we can gain those permits. We do, and that is built into, obviously, our planning horizon. And if we find out early on that we cannot do it because the state will not support it, then we have to be nimble and adjust. But that means when we adopt a master plan, which is, I said this before, we can't plan 1 year at a time. These facilities take so long for you to permit and for you to construct, we really have to plan 10 years out or more. And that means if the board is committed to a master plan, whatever that is, then we're moving in that direction. We're getting the state's input as we move in that direction. If we find out they're not going to support doing something, then we bring back to the board new ways to handle that. But all along, we're following the master plan until you tell us not to follow the master plan.
And in this master plan and in the discussions that we had, you know, just like today, what we talked about with the price, you know, we're sitting and listening to information given to us by staff.
Sure.
That, you know, if we do this, we won't have to do this later. You know, this is the cost, but now we're seeing that, you know, that changed even the rates on building a new plant.
They will.
It goes up significantly.
Yes.
And so if we're making decisions on what the customer rate's going to be on a rosy scenario, and then it turns into something much worse, you can't stop the train.
You make a good point, and this is one of the things that.
Brian, I want to say something
sir.
first,
Yes,
so
sir.
I'm about to bust. This is a Chicken Little, the sky is falling. It is not Public Works' fault for giving us false information. Y'all deal with the regulators. Andy, and I'll ask Brian, I think the state reviews our sewer permits on 5-year periods. Is that right? What they have done since Crooked Creek was built, they have changed the whole process approval. If Monroe builds a new sewage treatment plant, their cost of operation is going to double because the new plant will be built to current standards, where they're still allowing the old plant, like our Crooked Creek, to discharge at old levels. It cost us more to process sewage at 12 Mile because it was built later and we have higher standards. Is that right? So, you know, you can say, why didn't we plan for this? Because the state keeps changing the scenario.
Right.
And if we had built that plan in 2016, I wasn't here then, and I'm not faulting anybody who had. But this is the fastest growing county in the state. It's got the best school system, and yet we drag our feet on infrastructure. And we all know that if we build it today, it'll be cheaper than a year from now.
Yes, sir. And so.
I just don't want to see you sit there and try to grapple with why didn't we plan for this or why didn't we plan for that? We are a bullet racing through the economy, and it's hard to, as Michelle says, build the airplane after you take off. But that's basically what this management team has done and this public works team has done, and we just keep zigging and zagging.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, so, you know, the discussion is good. Ultimately, what it boils down to, and this is what we continue to bring to you for you to react to, is every year things change. They change, costs change, some of the regulatory requirements change, and we have to be able to adjust to those. But what we do struggle with is unknowns from the board. We struggle with what your commitment is as far as what we're going to do, because all of that drives our work, our workload and our work product. And I will tell you, and I know some of you heard this, the City of Monroe established essentially a flatline rate increase that they put into their system in order to accommodate the unknowns that they have to deal with, as well as the knowns they had to deal with. They specifically said, we're going to have an annual rate increase that is close to the CPI. Now, you may say you don't want to do that, and I understand that, but when we build certainty into what we do, it helps us also plan for that. And so when we do 1 year rate at a time, then that means every year we have to adjust and say, well, we didn't know what was going to happen because we didn't have a defined rate from the board. It makes it more difficult, and the rates can change. We always can defer things. I want you to understand that if the board approves projects, we may have to defer projects because the funding is not available to pay for it. But if we have a defined revenue stream that the board has agreed to, it is much easier for us to manage the system that way.
And that 3% that Monroe put on their rate increases has got them sitting there on $60 million for their sewer plant building in a bucket right now.
We understand that you are faced with the issues of your ratepayers and your taxpayers. We're sensitive to that, but we're also in responsibility. We have responsibility for giving you advice on how to manage your utility. All we can do is what you direct us to do. So I don't want to beleaguer that because we have some other things that you asked some questions about, so I do want to talk, unless you have more questions for me, I do want to address those questions.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Did you have a question?
And here's where I think we don't have water to put in that plant, and we don't have enough interbasin transfer. If we built a plant 5 years ago, we don't have a place to put the water. We don't have enough water interbasin transfer to do that. That wouldn't be the solution.
For the new plan is what you're saying?
Right,
Okay.
right. So it has to come with the water. The water from Yadkin and the plant are in a symbiote, they're in a relationship. They have to be together. But, you know, here's the concern that I have. And again, this is not you all, this is previous staff all the way through. And it seems like it's a more rosy scenario than when it's our budget. And in our budget, we tend to be very conservative in our earnings, and we tend to be very conservative in what we think we're going to get, and then we're pleasantly surprised when it's better. But in Public Works, there's an opposite feel there. It seems to be more rosy in the predictions about that we're not going to have to raise rates as much. And this is every prediction since I got back on board. And we used to do 6.5% increases to make sure that we could meet these needs. And I supported those. But then it jumped to, 15.5%. And that was not predicted. That was not shown to us.
Sure.
In anything I've ever remembered seeing.
Certainly.
And so now, and this is what I asked you yesterday, I remember a lower number being the rosy projection.
Sure.
And it's worse. And I just wonder if we shouldn't be given the worst projections, the worst possible scenario, like we are given in the budget time for our tax rates, when we're setting tax rates. I don't know that maybe that shouldn't be given to us now. This is.
I 100% agree with you. And I would say to that, which is one of the reasons why we have given you the high number for the Lower Crooked Creek plant. And even that number can change. As you saw, the consultant came in, the time at which that was done versus the time at which we are today, they had a high estimate of $318 million versus $276 million. We don't know what from year to year the economy is going to do. All we can give you is our best estimate. I agree with you that we should be giving you what we think the cost is going to be with escalation. But what we are not are soothsayers. I don't know what the economy will be. In 2019, let's be honest, we had a plan of $300 million for Yadkin. If you were to build that today, I bet you it's $350+ million to build that today. No one could have predicted that it was going to go up by $50 million in 2+ years. We couldn't have made that prediction. All we can do is give you estimates. But here's what comes with that. When we give you a higher estimate, that has to be built into your rate model, which equals higher rates. So I'm happy to tell you need higher rates, but understand we're building into it higher estimates which generate higher rates. It's a balance. What do you want us to do? Do you want us to give you a good picture? Do you want us to try to be as close as possible? We try. Do you want us to give you the sky's falling number? And we can. That's going to dictate that rates are much higher. Either way, I'm like a weatherman. We are never right. I will tell you.
I know you have been as straightforward as you can. You
Yes, sir.
answer the questions like they need to be answered. But then you look at the system development fees, and are we accounting for the worst case scenario in the system development fees? Are we looking at what contribution needs to be made by the people who benefit from
Mr. Chairman, is this monologue going to end after a period of time? I'd like to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know.
Well, I mean, by all means, finish your thought that you've monopolized the dais for some time now. I'd like to say a few things.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to just segue off of something you said, Brian, which I think bears repeating. You're not a soothsayer. Public Works staff are not soothsayers. None of us are soothsayers.
One of us.
Well, nobody here is a soothsayer, and none of us have a crystal ball. And a big difference, Commissioner Rushing brought up a comparison between fiscal year planning, budget planning, and the kind of planning and anticipation that goes into public works. Big difference. There's a big difference in staring into the next fiscal year when you're maybe 5 or 6 or 7 months out from a new fiscal year or adopting a new budget, and the kind of planning and anticipation that you have to do over 3, 4, or 5 years. They're not even comparable, Commissioner Rushing. Big difference. Also, I mean, when you look back at 2019 and wag your finger, at Public Works saying, look at everything that you got wrong here, I mean, it's just, it defies credulity, frankly. That you would take any staff or any of us to task for what was anticipated back in 2019, before the Federal Reserve increased the money supply by over 50 or 60%, before we shut down the economy and had severe, profound disruptions to our supply chain, before we saw unanticipated, I think by most everybody, increases in materials costs, labor costs. It may be helpful politically. It may be helpful when you look at past presentations and point out where predictions went awry. But to reasonable people, nobody can, in good conscience, look back 3, 4, or 5 years and say, well, look at what you got wrong here, and now we're just going to sit in paralysis and not do anything. That is not a valid option. All we're left with is the information that's before us. We try to do the best that we can in an imperfect world with imperfect, incomplete information, based on the expertise of staff and consultants, based on what we know of the economy, based on what we think we need to do in terms of capital expenditures, based on what's happening in the legislature and in the regulatory environment. We take all of that information, all of that skill, all of that experience, and we do the best job we can imperfectly, and we try to make the next right decision. And instead of navel gazing, instead of looking back 2, 3, 4, 5 years about predictions that, surprise, surprise, aren't aligned with reality. Do any of us really expect anything different? I mean, that's life. That's life. So let's busy ourselves with being responsible, looking at the information today as we have it, and try to make the next right decision. I would sincerely appreciate if all 5 of us could stop looking, at what was presented to us 3, 4, 5 years ago, and genuinely and sincerely ask ourselves, based on the information before us today, what is the next right decision, for the best interest of our county, the best interest of the water and sewer system. That's what I'm going to resolve to do today, is try to make that next best decision. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That look is worth $1 million.
I will go on to the questions for the board had about Lincoln County, and I believe it was Concord. I think it was Concord. Yes, Concord. So you had questions about why we showed a 0% rate increase, and of course that was information we had gotten from those jurisdictions. Our staff did reach out to those jurisdictions to try to get an understanding of why they were going through a 0% rate increase. For Lincoln County, they spoke with their Public Works Director. He was in 2021, he left, he's in Rock Hill now. But he indicated that the reason that board did not do a rate increase is they had done a 3-year rate increase of 5% per year for water and 15% per year for wastewater, and that the board just felt like, from a political standpoint, they needed to take a break from that. So that's why they felt like they were not doing a rate increase because of those large increases they had over the last 3 years. And of course, that was driven by a lot of the growth in projects that they had. Just as other information, the gentleman who is now in Rock Hill did indicate that they are also doing an increase for water and wastewater for Rock Hill. We did not have that included. And then for Concord, we did contact Concord about that, and one of their, again, this is more driven by policy decision by board. They are doing a voter bond referendum for a Parks and Rec bond, and they did not want to have their taxpayers as well as their ratepayers be hit with an increase for the bond for the parks as well as an increase for water and sewer. Those were the reasons driving those 0% rate increases. So we wanted to clarify that for you. So we've reached the point at which now, I actually do also want to mention that yesterday I did say that we had not had a cost of service analysis done. That was incorrect. We had a rate study back in 2011, presented in 2012. There was a cost of service analysis as part of that. I wanted to clarify that, make sure that the public as well as the board is aware of that information. We always want to be transparent on that. We're now at the point where we've got some additional scenarios for the board to see. We showed you some yesterday. We've got just a couple of more. And then we really want to get into discussions about how do you want to move forward with those items. So I'm going to get Andy
Brian,
to come up.
Brian, before
Yes, sir.
Andy comes, on the cost
Take
of
a
rate.
break. It is actually 10. You might want to take a break. I don't know. I thought about
I just
that.
got a quick question.
Yeah.
So on the cost of service study that was done previously.
2011, yes, sir.
2011, were the rates adjusted based on the cost of service?
It's my understanding it was. I don't have the specifics of that because we just got that information yesterday.
Okay.
So I wasn't able to dig into it deeply.
I think it would be interesting to know whether or not, there was a true up leveling of the cost of service between the water and the sewer utility at that time. Just trying to, in my mind, trying to reconcile the differences that we have today.
Certainly.
And how that, it had to start at some point.
Sure.
Was it a rounding, I want to say a rounding error,
Yeah,
but was
just
it a rounding situation that, has kind of multiplied itself over time? What exactly, just trying to understand what happened.
Absolutely. We will certainly get into that and give the board that. I just didn't have time to determine whether or not that was done. Yes, sir. See, does the board want to take a break before we get into?
That'd be fine. Let's take 10 minutes.
Okay.
We'll reconvene or come back in at 10:14.
Thank you, sir.
Let's proceed.
Shall we proceed, Mr. Chairman? I have just a few additional follow-up items to go over relative to rate scenarios in response to some discussion from yesterday, and then a couple of options that came up as a result of the discussion, from a staff perspective. One of the things we wanted to come back and look at was just highlight what a no rate increase scenario looked like. And so what we did yesterday afternoon was actually ran the model to say, how long could we go with no rate increases? And to do so, what would we have to remove from our expenditure requirements to do that in a way where we would still meet our reserve and our debt service coverage requirements? And so in the no rate increase scenario, we were able to keep about 56% of the baseline capital improvement program. And so that notably includes these items listed here on the slides. Some projects that currently have appropriations as well as future costs planned for transmission main phases, interceptor improvements, force main improvements. We also did include projects that currently have been identified, such as number 5 with state grants. We did include the Grassy Branch project that's required as a result of a consent order, and then several of the R&R programs that John spoke of yesterday that are necessary for a lot of our different asset categories. In the no rate increase scenario, though, there were a number of items that we could not include that were in the baseline scenario. It was about 44% of the costs. So we had to take out, in this scenario, a lot of the South Zone tank and transmission improvements. We had to take out a couple pump station upgrades. In number 762 zone, there's a 12-inch main as well as an expansion that we had to take out. No diversion pumping improvements. We were not able to include many of the expansion-related items. So no expansion of the Catawba plant, no Yadkin expansions, no short line extensions in the future, no 12 Mile Creek expansions or relief interceptor, no Site B, and no water line extensions. So we fundamentally had to, from this scenario, exclude a lot of growth-related items and upgrades and improvements.
How do we opt out of the Catawba River? I thought that was a 50-50 and we had to do it.
So, that's a good question. Yeah. We have a partnership with the Catawba, and in that partnership, it does spell out that one of the organizations can decide that they do not want to move forward with an expansion. We have done that as a partnership in the past. And in fact, that we've led that in the past. It's been Union County asking for the expansions, and Lancaster has said, yes, okay, we'll go along with that. There is a provision for where we could say, no, we're not suggesting you do that, but there is a provision where we could say, listen, guys, we really can't participate in the expansion.
And this is again for purposes of running a scenario to show how we could have a no rate increase scenario be sustainable and what would be the cost included in that scenario.
When you say sustainable, what do you?
So we mean that we would be able to meet our reserve requirements that we've defined for the board policy, as well as our debt service coverage requirements from the bonds that we have outstanding. And going forward in time, we did those 0 rate increases as long as we could until we had to do some level of increase to account for inflation, covering the cost of those R&R programs. And so that's really when I'm kind of defining sustainability as. So not using all of our cash, not going into default on our debt coverage ratios would be the 2 big parts of that definition. And so this chart just shows graphically the orange bars would be the capital spending by year in this no increase scenario. And in total, it's about $270 million as compared to the baseline CIP that we presented, which was about $488 million over that same 10-year time period. And so when we ran that scenario, we were able to go basically 3 years, 23 through 25, without an increase. And then starting in fiscal 26, we need about a 3.5% annual increase to accommodate ongoing inflation and to make sure we hit those minimum debt service coverage ratios and kept our reserves at the target. You can see in 26, it's maybe just a tiny bit below that reserve level, but it's very close to that target. So this is where we tried to again, keep everything as low as possible, as long as possible, but recognize that even at some point inflation is going to cause our costs to go above our current revenue streams in this type of a scenario.
But that means none of those
None of those projects.
that were on that second list.
That's correct. That 44% of the capital plan, or about 200 million of projects, would not be included in this scenario. And then we ran an alternative version of this scenario that looked at incorporating the rate structure potential modifications for the industrial rates, as well as the miscellaneous fee items that Hung mentioned this morning. And so that would represent about combined 1.6 million of additional revenue, that if we were to add that to this scenario, we were able to defer and increase one additional year from 26 to 27, but the increase would just need to be slightly higher. We can't completely avoid that needed revenue from that year, but we could at least defer it a little bit and keep the increase after that at about 4% a year. So, we could have run this scenario keeping an increase in 26 and just lowering that increase by about 2 or 2.5%, but we thought we'd show it just deferring it a year, given that increase in the out years was pretty comparable. And so at this point, we also wanted to run one additional scenario for your consideration. I'm going to recap all of these here in just a moment, relative to the plan that had the Site B for Lower Crooked Creek included. Yesterday, we'd gone over a scenario that showed 8% increases over the next few years and then dropping down to 3%. Given the past precedent for what happened with the Yadkin plant, where we compressed those increases over 2 years, we ran another scenario that showed keeping the increases at 4% a year, consistent with the baseline scenario for 3 years, then going to 15.5% for 2 years to cover the anticipated debt and operating cost impacts from the plant, and then dropping back to the same inflationary plan thereafter. So this is a more kind of compressed rate scenario to account for the cost of the Site B in a way that's similar with what was done with the Yadkin plant, where it was compressed into a shorter time period. So just again, a different option for you to consider about how you might go about addressing the cost requirements for that scenario. Instead of a level plan, this really compresses it down to 2 years right when you're incurring those costs during construction. And so at this point, I just kind of wanted to recap the different scenarios that we've looked at, and I thought I might ultimately leave this slide when I fully build it out for you on the screen during your discussions. And so we've identified the updated baseline scenario that does include the water expansion projects. The 12-mile expansion to 9 MGD does not include expanding 12-mile to 12 MGD or Site B, and that's about just under 500 million of capital costs. The alternative scenario we looked at below that was no wastewater expansion, so we keep the water short line and line extension projects, we keep the water cost in, but there's no expansion of 12-mile to 9 MGD or 12 or the Site B, and so that CIP is a little bit lower, about 460 million. The no growth scenario would remove the water component as well as not include any of the wastewater expansions, and so that capital cost in 10-year CIP is about 300 million. Obviously, we're taking out a substantial amount of growth-related projects in that option. The Site B plan would include the water expansions, taking the 12-mile plant up to 12 MGD, and also including Site B. That would be the $820 million 10-year capital improvement program. And then the scenario that I just showed you, the no rate increase scenario, obviously we wouldn't have any of those expansion costs. We'd be pulling out a few other things, and that would have the capital improvement program at about 270 million over that 10-year time period. And so for each of these scenarios, we've run at least one rate option, in some cases two, that I wanted to just build for you here. So for that baseline scenario, we're looking at a plan of level increases of 4% a year to cover those identified costs for that particular scenario. We did run an alternative of that scenario that said, well, if we don't do an increase in 23, how would that impact the out years? And they would need to be at 4.5% per year for those same cost requirements. So this is really a distinction of just a choice of how you would do the rates for this particular scenario. We also ran the rates for the no wastewater expansion scenario, and they were a little bit lower in the 5-year period through 27 at 3.5% per year. But then because we don't have those growth of customers and accounts in the future years, the increases had to be slightly higher going forward in that 28 period at 5.5% per year for the remainder of the forecast period.
Say that again, please, sir.
So for the
Very significant statement.
It is, and we showed the chart yesterday that showed taking these increases forward, that because we don't have the growth from that wastewater expansion scenario that we would otherwise if we built the capacity in the future, we have fewer units to spread our cost over. And so as we have the same renewal and replacement inflationary pressures we have a fewer number of customers to spread them over, which means the rates have to be higher. And so that's why you see those increases in that no wastewater expansion scenario being higher after the growth that we could accommodate with our existing facilities basically phases out, and we don't have future growth at that point.
Thank you, sir.
Additionally, we looked at a no-growth scenario, not just on the wastewater side, but also not expanding the water system. And so again, while that will have a lower cost in the near term, in the long term, in 28 through 32, you'll see those increases are at about 4.5% a year as compared to our baseline, which is at 4%. So again, it's showing that no growth has a higher long-term consequence when we have to factor in covering our regulatory, renewal and replacement, and inflationary costs over a smaller customer base. We then looked at the Site B alternative. The one we looked at yesterday was trying to spread those costs out over a level time period. So that was looking at 8% increases from 23 to 27. And then thereafter, this is the highest growth scenario that we have. So those future increases are the lowest of any of the options at 3% per year in this particular scenario. And then I just presented an alternative plan that would stick with the baseline increases for 3 years, but then do a compressed schedule of increases in 26 and 27, and then return to the same level of indexing as the original Site B scenario that was presented yesterday. And then finally, we looked at the no rate increase scenario, and the first option we presented, showed that we could go through about 2025 with no increases, and then we'd start at 3.5%. But again, this is a substantial cut to the capital improvement program. We're going from, in the baseline scenario, in round numbers, 500 million to about 275 million. So it's a very significant reduction in capital spending for this scenario. And then we also looked at a variation of that factored in some additional revenue from potential industrial rate structure changes that we talked about, as well as miscellaneous fee items that Hung mentioned this morning. And that might allow us to potentially defer that one more year, but the increase would need to be slightly higher if we were to make that type of a deferral. So this slide kind of encapsulates the different options that we've looked at to date over the last couple of days, mostly yesterday, but then the couple of other items we brought up this morning. And hopefully is a good basis of discussion for you to have and to refer to as you work through the deliberation process on capital and rate scenarios. And I would just say before I turn it over to Brian that just keep in mind for a typical water and sewer customer, that bill for 5,000 gallons is about $100 a month. So think of these increases in that term. So a 4% increase represents about $4 on that typical monthly bill for a combined water and sewer customer. And if it's water only, it's even less than that because, as the commissioner pointed out, the water bill is about maybe $25 to $45 per month. So it's going to be a much more modest impact. So keep the dollars in mind as you evaluate this too in the context of the overall bill. Sometimes we get caught up in percentages and lose fact of what they're being applied to. So with that, Brian, I'd like to turn it over to you and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Do you have any questions for Andy while? Okay. So this is the part where we're obviously going to try to get the board to give us some direction. And I think it's important that, and Commissioner Williams pointed this out, we are your staff, and I think it is our obligation to give you our recommendation on what we think is the best long-term solution for the utility. You give the direction, you make the decisions, but I do think we have a responsibility to tell you what we believe is best for the long term of the utility. And if you were to ask us, we would tell you that we think for the long-term viability of the utility, the Site B option is the option for the board to consider because it does build into it additional capacity, it builds into additional customers. We're not, again, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but we're making good quality estimates based on what we think will happen. And this also gets to the board's desire or interest in talking with our communities, our towns, about allocation. I've said this before. If you don't have capacity to allocate, then an allocation policy doesn't work the paper it's written on. You have to have capacity to work with them on having an agreement. And we think this gets you to that. If we don't have capacity, because we don't build expansion projects, then really that discussion is moot at this point in time. So from a staff perspective, that would be the one we would recommend you consider. Obviously, we know you have to take into consideration the issues dealing with your citizenry. We know that, and we are sensitive to that. That's why we've given you options for you to think about. There's a lot in between. These are scenarios based on
what we thought you could consider. You can always move things around, make some changes, and that will affect the rates in some way, and we will be happy to run those scenarios for you once you tell us that. But what I'm hoping now is to get some dialogue with you about things you like about it, things you don't like about it, what you'd like to see done differently, how you'd like to approach this. I do want to point out, because this was not addressed in this, is we see the no rate increase rate structure down at the bottom where you were able to add an additional year at 0% if you made changes to the rate structure and the industrial based. None of that was factored into the other items. So keep in mind that if you decide that you want to, number one, increase our miscellaneous fees and charges as we requested, if you make changes to the rate structures, adding the industrial rates and making that, it could very well lower some of those rates that you're seeing by a percentage or so. That's not running here because we weren't sure whether you would accept that or not. It's only shown on the 0% rate increase item, but keep in mind that if we know that's what you want to do, then that could very well change, say, Site B from 8% in year 2023 to 7%. Now, future years, it may still be 8, but it may lower that 1 year from some 8 to 7. Don't know the exact answer to that, but I just want to make that clarification for you. I also want to stress that whatever decisions you make, that there could be impacts to our rating. This isn't the sky's falling, but the rating agencies look at decisions you make as a board. And if you make decisions that they feel may have a negative consequence, they could, in fact, take action to lower our bond rating. I'm not predicting it. I'm merely saying keep that in mind when you're making decisions. They're going to look at what you do, and they're going to look at how close we get to some of our ratios, and they will make an informed decision on that. And we will have to borrow money at some point in the future. We can't cash fund everything. We will need debt. So just keep those things in mind. I'm here now if you have some questions. How do you want to proceed?
Brian?
Yes, sir.
Which baseline do y'all recommend?
Well, again, we recommend the item which is Site B, which is the 8% increase for the next few years and then a potential lower. Because we're looking at it from a utility perspective. That is adding capacity and being able to address your needs for the future. Now, I didn't say this, but it is 8 to 10 years or more to put a new Site B plant in place. No one wants to hear this, but Crooked Creek is going to run out of capacity long before we have that plant in place. I'm not trying to use the M word, but we're going to run out of capacity in Crooked Creek long before you put a plant in place, which means that section of the county, that northern section, will not have any sewer that we can serve for that. It will be done until you put in, or not, a plant in place.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Brian, you keep talking about the viability of the water utility and things like that.
Yes, sir.
It's much more than that. It's the viability of Union County and our economic growth, our livelihood. I think about I've had numerous calls from people said, I moved here 6 months ago. There's enough people here now. Don't let any more growth. Well, that's not reasonable. This county has grown. It's very attractive. We talk about our schools. We talk about the safety. We got one of the safest counties in the state. This not doing the right thing can negatively impact economic development and the growth of our county. And the county's going to grow. I mean, I've been here when there was 40,000 people. Now there's 240. So it's critical that we do make the right decision, not a political decision, because it's easy to say, no, I'm not going to raise rates, I'm not going to raise taxes and things like that. But, we're in the Biden administration, and inflation's rampant. They're threatening that we'll run out of diesel fuel, and if that happens, it's going to impact us too. So I'm just saying it's much more important than just the viability of the utility, which is important. I'm not taking anything away from that. But, you know, water's, can't do without water. So just my commentary.
I understand, yes, sir. So you asked, Chairman, and I told you, you know, from a staff's perspective, we would certainly recommend that the site be, and I understand, that's a big lift, I get it. I mean, it is, but to Commissioner Rushing's point, we don't want to give you a rosy picture. We want to give you the picture we think is realistic, and we think that's a realistic picture. Now, whether or not you feel that's the direction Union County should go, that's your decision. If you feel like that we don't need to provide capacity for that, that's fine. That's what we will accomplish. But from a utilities perspective, that's what we think is better. Now, you do have at the top the updated baseline. That one does not include the, obviously, the Site B. It does include an expansion to 12 mile to 9 MGD. It does include expansion for water. So it gives you some expansion, but it does not take into consideration expanding 12 Mile Creek, expanding Crooked Creek in the future. As Andy pointed out, there is always the other option, and that is the delayed increases for Site B. In other words, I run with the baseline model of 4% for 3 years, but then you have those very large increases like we had with Yadkin in order to accommodate doing the Site B project if you make a decision to do the Site B project. So what it really boils down to is what capital do you want to include in your plan and what capital do you not want to include in your plan? Because I think we've tweaked out about as much as we can do unless you change your policy. If you change your policy, that's a different ballgame, but we've tweaked out, I think, as much as we can get and gotten it to these scenarios.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Brian, if I understood correctly from the earlier presentation, the equalizing of rates, I think that was in the what-if scenario.
Yes, sir.
That's not included in any of this, right?
It is not.
I'd be interested in knowing if we equalize rates. For instance, we have the one large customer that's paying $3.20 per 1,000 gallons. If we were to equalize rates like that, if we were to finish the second part of the fee schedule increases, you know, what would that do to the Site B schedule here?
Okay.
I'd be interested in knowing that for sure.
All right. I think we can certainly get that for you. I can't promise we can get that for you like within the next hour or
Right,
so,
no.
but we certainly can get
Yeah,
that.
so it's interesting because Andy and I were just having a conversation off to the side about exactly to your point. So for example, on the Site B delayed increases, if you do the 4, the 4, and the 4, the model predicts a 15.5, but it's not the rate structure adjustments, miscellaneous fees, and even the system development fee updates are not included in that 15.5% in that particular model. So yes, there would be some impact, and we would have to go back and calculate exactly what that might be.
I think what we will do is you know, and again, the board can ask us to any variation, but I think what we'll do is we'll take the Site B as it is with the 8%, show you what impact we think that will have, and then we'll also show you the Site B delayed, so you can see both of those. If you want to
Yeah, I
see
really
in a
would.
different
I would
scenario-
appreciate that because I know the impulse among all 5 of us, I don't doubt that, is, you know, before we contemplate increases on regular ratepayers, you know, let's equalize the rates throughout the system first in a way that's consistent with a utility-based rationale. Let's finish the fee increases, the fee schedule increases that, as I recall, you know, we've only done one part of that, and we hadn't previously updated that schedule for about a
25
quarter of a
years.
century.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So let's contemplate changes like that first and then see potentially, you know, what that does to rate increases for these scenarios.
we can certainly do that. And I appreciate Hyung actually bringing something up that I actually did not think to also give you some, something you think about is that each one of these different options also has an impact ultimately on your system development fees. And I didn't think to say that. Andy did say that earlier, but understand that the projects that we put in our capital plan will drive what those system development fees will be, whether it's buy-in, combined, or incremental. It will drive some of those changes. And so if the board makes a decision that we are not going to do a lot of capital projects, it may very well be that some of those decrease. Some may stay close. The buy-in method may stay close because the Yadkin project is being added in there, and that may be okay. But under the sewer scenario, that number may actually come down because you're not having capital to spread that out over. So just keep that in mind. Those are all things that we have to adjust for. And right now, what's in this model, because we can only do what we have, is what our current system development fees, what our current rates are, that's what's in there today. If you make a change and say, we're going to change the rate structure, that needs to be adjusted. If you change system development fees, that's going to change as well, which, just understand, we're doing the best that we can to give you as much information, but it's only what we know.
Anything else? Well, that sort of throw the curve as far as my thinking.
I threw you a curve, okay. Well, again, one of our issues here is the manager has a budget that he has to present to you, and the Public Works budget has to be a part of that. And we obviously want to give you what we think you'll support. We don't want to give you a budget that you're not going to adopt. Now, there are always tweaks and things that are made, and we understand that, but we don't want to present a budget that we know that you're absolutely going to say, we're not approving that. So that's why we're seeking your input here, because it's next week, the manager has to give you a budget and say, this is my recommended budget of it. So this is what we're going to do. And so I'm not hearing to do anything differently. We're going to present this to the manager with this Site B as being the one that we recommend. He may choose not to include that. It's the manager's budget. He can make the decisions on what he wants to include or not include. We're going to show the Site B with the rate changes. Obviously, we'll send you that information so you know what it is. And then as a board, or if the manager decides, he can make changes to it, you can make changes to it. But we've got to give him something for him to react to. So unless I hear something different, that's how we're going to approach this.
Let me go down, start with you, Richard. What's your thoughts?
I agree with Brian's assessment. But like David said, before we actually take the hard vote on it, we need to have the impacts of
And we're not asking for a hard vote tonight. I want you to understand that. But yes, sir, we agree.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Brian, and Commissioner Helms. I will say this, I invite some slings and arrows here, but, we all know what's happening with the purchasing power of the dollar. The purchasing power of the dollar is declining for everything. That's what inflation is. And, the water and sewer system, aren't immune from that. So, again, I'm very interested in learning, how this changes based on, finishing the fee schedule updates and equalizing of rates. But this commissioner understands there's going to be some sort of fee increase that I'm comfortable supporting. So those are my thoughts on it.
Yes, sir.
If we don't do a Site B, I know farmland's going to start getting gobbled up in Union County. I know of one farmer that has got 11 one-acre lots under contract right now for $65,000 an acre. These are lots on red fields with county water, and these people, either a Union County builder buying the lot and building it to sell. So if Site B doesn't happen, land that will perk is going to start leaving the farm program. And, part of what sometimes I was sitting here thinking a while ago, the most conservative county in North Carolina, and we're thinking about messing with our reserves. Reserves is what carries you through low spots in the economy. Stoney?
I'm not going to vote for any rate increases.
Certainly understand.
When we're taking money away from people who are affected by inflation, just like we are, and giving it to people who are selling homes and buying lots for $65,000, for $5,000 or $6,000 more, they can pay for the infrastructure that they need. So, there's a different way.
Certainly.
And, one board can't tie the hands of future boards. Thank you.
Yes, sir, I understand.
One board can't what?
Tie the hands of future boards.
Commissioner Simpson?
I agree with Commissioner Williams. I'm not crazy about meetings, but I think you could probably work with the manager to work in an additional meeting or work session with this additional information so that when you bring that budget or at that meeting, you can provide your
Certainly.
updated recommendation.
Updated information, yes,
We'll
sir.
have all the information we need that we can make a decision.
Certainly.
Feed that information to the manager. That'd be my suggestion.
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to say that, first off, I appreciate the board's patience and understanding. I do. We are sensitive to what decisions you have to make. We understand that they are difficult. And we will, whatever the decision is, we will implement your decision, and that will be how we march forward. So I'll work with the manager. We'll come up with a potential another date where we can go over this with you so that you can see any changes to these numbers. And we'll actually try to change all of these numbers if we can. I'll work with our folks and see if that's possible, if we can update all of these baseline numbers. We did give you the one at the bottom with that, but if it's possible, that way you see them all. You've got the gambit there. I'm not sure if we had another item to discuss. Yes. So what we'll obviously do is try to get a meeting scheduled, and then hopefully we'll have some consensus from the board, and that will be built into the manager's budget, and then we can go from there on that. Any more questions for me and for our staff and our experts that come here today to help present this?
Richard?
On your meter installation fee, 3/4 and 1 inch went up considerably,
Yes, sir.
but the 1.5 didn't. Why? What's different? Other than 1.5 is probably going to be a more commercial.
Yeah,
When we did the initial study for the miscellaneous fees and charges, we were charged, the original fee was $1,400, and our cost of service that was estimated was $1,120. And so we went ahead and took it down to where it should be.
So it was
We were
higher
charging.
before you.
Yep.
We lowered it fully.
Yep. So, and again, what they tried to do is similar to what our folks with Stantec did with the cost of service for water and sewer. We tried to evaluate what truly does it cost to make a connection? What does it cost to do these things so that our ratepayers are not subsidizing new customers coming on? Those new customers should cover those costs. I mean, that's only fair. So that was the idea, is that we try to have those costs spread out so that the new customers pay what they should be paying, and that we recover those appropriately. Any more questions for myself or anyone else?
No, I've got a comment. Stoney, I've always said you're a smart person, and I really respect that. And I didn't know how I was going to sort of walk into this, but you gave me, when you said no board can bind future board's hands. Well, no future board can bind current board hands. So I know you're big on transparency. So I would like for you to tell us what you discussed yesterday with the manager and our attorney so that we can all know and hear it from you.
What I discussed was exactly what we heard in the election that we just went through, that in December, planned that anything that was done the day after the election and the next day can be undone. And that what we need to be concerned with is what are the costs associated with that. If we buy land, which I'm not opposed to necessarily buying land and locking it in, but it's the way that things are paid for that we have to change. We don't need to change the rates. We need to change the way and the timing that things are paid for. And people in the building community who are concerned with the uncertainty, they're concerned that they haven't been included in the discussions, that they've not been included in some of the solutions. They want to be included in the solutions. We have people that are willing to double what the current system capacity fees are. And I'm sure some are not, but some are. We have legislators who are willing to look at the solutions, our local legislators, which are willing to come to the table, find some solutions that work for Union County, because we're unusual in the fact that we run our system. If you look at that list that we were given earlier, it's a lot of cities, towns. So just understand to this board that the decisions that we're going to make are, especially if it's going to be a rate increase, I don't see that rate increase holding. And whether it's a freezing of public works until we can get a solution that the ratepayers are not footing the bill for growth, whatever that means in December and January of next year, there's going to have to be some hard discussions. But if we just give it away and we're going to raise $4, just $4, well, what if there's a different way? And what if we don't have to take $4 more out of the pocket of a small family? You know, it's just, again, the people spoke with a loud and clear voice, and I understand that y'all don't want me asking questions, but the last 4 commissioners that have been elected in Union County, well, 5 if you include me, that have won elections in Union County, it's by telling the people that we were not interested in higher taxes and higher rates. And our citizens don't want us to go in this direction. Earlier, somebody said that they're tired of the growth and you know, they don't want any more houses built. Well, the city of Monroe is going to build houses, and Union County is going to gain tax base from that. We can't stop the city of Monroe from voluntarily annexing properties and giving it sewer. But what we can do is the other areas of the county, the donut holes, the towns, the unincorporated areas, we can still do these projects, not all of them, but we still can do some expansion projects if there's a difference in the way we collect our system development fees. And that's what has to have a serious consideration before we look at raising rates. And again, I think the builders, I think a majority of them, realtors, builders, I think a lot would be in support of helping us do it the right way so that their customers who buy those homes, they recoup the cost in that when they sell the home versus the citizens who are already here subsidizing new growth. If this was for repairs and things on the system, that would be different, but no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about expansion of the system, and that expansion is for future growth, future residential growth. We have an industrial park where the city of Monroe is going to be providing sewer for it. When we have a town like Monroe that provides fire service, police protection, when they provide garbage service, when they provide all these services to their citizens, and they get a tax rate out of it, that's a benefit to Union County just as it is to Monroe. We still get those customers. We still get those citizens. We still get those homes and that tax base. and those jobs and all the stuff that goes along with it. But there are things like fire protection and police protection that it doesn't burden the current residents of Union County. You know, it is what it is. And the people spoke with a loud voice on Tuesday.
They spoke with a loud voice, but what you said about Monroe, they don't have to educate those children. They don't have to build buildings. And a $350,000 house with 3 children costs Union County money.
So you're saying not only we're going to subsidize the utilities, we're going to subsidize the education of those children. So you're not making the argument that we need to grow. And if we don't need to grow, then we don't need to build infrastructure. So again, it's just a circular argument. If things don't pay for themselves, then why do we grow? I believe that growth pays for itself. And I believe growth should be made to pay for itself if, even in utilities, if that's possible. And if that's not possible, then we shouldn't be doing it.
Well, you certainly have voted for more high-density growth in your last 8 years than any of us.
Because you have to pay for the infrastructure that we're talking about. And the way that you pay for it is getting new customers, and your staff just told you that today.
Well, I can hear Stoney. I'm going to stop because I don't understand what you're saying.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If I can just say briefly, Commissioner Rushing, I think your impulse is shared by all of us that, you know, we would rather find other sources of funding. And we are, to the best of our ability, other than the ratepayers. You can say, and you're probably right in saying this, that the development community would be happy paying 2 times, 3 times what they pay now in system development fees. The problem is we are prohibited by statute in what we can charge with system development fees. You know, that is set out by statute. We have to do a study, and we're limited severely in what we can charge with system development fees. So it doesn't matter what a developer is willing to pay when we're limited in what we can charge. And we also have learned that when we do a new study, all of the development that's happened prior to that study date gets grandfathered, so they don't have to pay a system development fee again. And then that doesn't even include the incredibly cyclic, or the business cycle that we all know is part and parcel of development. You know, when you head into a recession or when you head into a period where rates rise, you're going to get less development, you're going to get less system development fees. So I applaud your impulse to look for every possible source other than ratepayers, and we are with this fee schedule, we are with this equalizing of rates. To the best of our ability, we are with system development fees. But one of the things I learned when I came into this job, a year and a half ago, is, and this is a real education that I think all of us would have to agree, gets impressed upon us, is how limited we are as county commissioners in our authority. You come into this job thinking you're going to be able to do a lot of wonderful things, and I don't want to diminish that there are opportunities to do wonderful things. But when you come into this job, you learn about a lot of the things that you can't do, and that unless the state legislature says that you have explicit authority to do this town or county commission, you can't do it. And that's where we are with a lot of these issues. We can't charge impact fees. We can't charge more than the schedule allows for system development fees. So, again, we're in a situation where we have information, that's, is as good as it can be at the time that we're considering it. We have the authority that the legislature gives us, and all we can do is make the best possible decision that we can. And again, I applaud your impulse. You're absolutely right. At some point, a new board is going to take over and have a majority, perhaps. And I look forward to a new board wrestling with the challenges of governing. It's a lot easier to look in the past, to look historically, and decide, that pick things apart and to make criticism from the back bench. But when you're actually in the arena having to govern and make hard decisions, I suspect perhaps some of the new members will develop the appreciation that I developed relatively early in this job, that reality doesn't always align with some of your preconceptions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And another thing, I talked with Senator Johnson last night, and he is agreeable to float this idea. But the strongest lobby in Raleigh will never allow this to happen. The home builders lobby is the most powerful lobby. And if it happens in Union County, then they'll say, well, it's going to spray it. They will nip this in the bud, I guarantee you. But if you pull it off, it would be good. I wish that they could pay for it, but like I say, they got our collection of system development fees reduced from half of the development to 111. And that really slowed it up. Go ahead.
And Commissioner Williams, I know well the limitations that are put on us by the state, that the state controls what we do, they control what the municipalities can do by statute. And the only way to change it is to change legislation, whether it's local legislation or state legislation, whichever. But you talk about the hard choice. The hard choice is not necessarily to raise rates on existing people to pay for new development. The hard choice is to do the choice that was given to us at zero. That's the hard choice. The simple choice is to just go with the flow, do things like we've always done, just raise the rates, just go forward and just do it the easy way so we don't have to fight for legislation. We don't have to make anybody mad that might support us. But the hard choice is to look our friends in the face and say, hey, listen, the easy road is over. We're going to say no expansion until we figure out a new way to pay for it. And it's a message that the people of Union County want to hear. And those people who say that we don't want any growth, they're not going to ever get no growth, because people can build on by right with a well and septic tank. And the thing that we have to do is, if we're going to build infrastructure, it's just like saying that we're going to build a sewer plant, but we're not going to do any high-density growth. Why build a sewer plant if you're not going to do high-density growth? It doesn't make sense. And the towns, all our towns elect people who say we're not going to have growth. We're going to manage growth. We're going to slow growth. We're going to stop building apartments. We're going to stop building this. We're going to stop building that. And if our elected people get in office, we're losing credibility every day, because not only us, but other people around this county get elected saying that they're going to do something, and the only thing that they're really concerned with is not high-density growth. They want the sewer plant. They want the high-density growth. They just want to tell people what color azaleas they have to plant, or how long the sidewalks are going to be, or how far away, what kind of, that you can't put Bradford pears in the neighborhood anymore. Jerry had to live through that, I think, for several years. So again, the hard choice is not to raise rates. The hard choice is to say, no, we're going to hold the line. We're not going to raise rates. We're going to figure out a different way that this is paid for. And you and I both voted for a rate decrease when you got on the board. And if we'd have had that rate decrease, what would the effect have been? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Hearing Mr. Rushing's comments yesterday really bothered me, because when I was elected commissioner, I made a commitment to citizens that I was going to do what, to my knowledge, was the best interest for the county. Not specific builder groups, but the entire county. So I have that obligation to do the right thing. And the statement that y'all are going to reverse it, and I assume you speak for all three, that you're going to reverse it, says you're trying to nullify this current board. I have a problem with that. I think, like I talked with the chairman, we need to continue on doing the best job we can with the information we have. And that's what I'm committed to do. I mean, if you want to cancel everything we do between now and the next 6 months, that's on you. But I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to fight for what's going on. Talking about connection fees, well, I just paid one of those connection fees for sewer. And I actually physically observed the individuals doing the work. I got a hell of a deal for that. What they had to go through to make that sewer connection, I was impressed. They did a great job, and I felt like I got my money's worth. So, yeah, but one thing you keep talking about what the developer is. You're Mr. Developer, you always have been, but there are other people in this county that want to build a home. And we need to think about all the people, not just the developers. I mean, I know several people in the area that I'm at right now are building homes, and every one of them are paying connection fees. And so you can't represent just the developers like you've done in the past. And I can tell you that economic growth is critical for this county. Economic growth is going to reduce the tax burden on the residents as we grow. I know you went on WBT and said if you got economic growth or residential, Union County doesn't want it. I mean, that's on record. But I tell you what, a lot of people want to come to Union County. There's a lot of people here, and we get a lot of citizens that get transferred down and they work here, and they call mom and dad and say, this is a great place to live. So if you want to shut those out, you know, you and your red wall, you know, y'all have to answer for that. But we need to do what's right with the information we have now, and we don't need to stop making progress in Union County because of a threat of the next board. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
And Commissioner Helms, you are correct. You did get a hell of a deal. But you got a hell of a deal because the ratepayers are subsidizing new growth and you're building a new house. So that's the problem.
You know, Stoney, that's
if you
BS.
paid a
That's
higher-
BS.
If you paid a higher capacity fee, system development fee, when you build your house, then the ratepayers would not have to pay for that. And you did get a hell of a deal.
You're the one that talked in your campaign.
And
You also
when-
stood up
and
and
when
said
I
that you're in
say-
South Carolina. Your range is in South Carolina, your beach house, and that's where you
My
wanted
beach
to
house is in
be.
North Carolina, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that's true. I'm sorry. I misspoke. It is in North Carolina.
Listen, guys.
It's not in Union County.
Listen, guys, it's going to be an ugly 6 months if we can't do the people's business. The only thing I'm arguing for is that people are tired of paying more to subsidize growth. Existing homes are tired of paying to subsidize new growth. And that's been clear message for years in Union County. And it's hard to look those developers that you say that I love and support so much in the face and say, hey, guys, sorry, you're going to have to pay more. But that's the truth, though.
I don't necessarily have a problem with adjusting it where it's
But
necessary.
you got a problem with me talking about it.
I don't know what you're saying. You had me blocked during the whole campaign.
I
so-
can't, you got me blocked. I can't, you got me, I don't know, I don't have you blocked. I
Well-
can't see anything you've got.
Well,
And it doesn't matter what I say it to everybody and I say it openly. And like you said, I said it on WBT. And somehow WBT thinks I'm the leader of opposition to growth in the county.
you are.
But you're saying I'm the biggest developer friend and there he is. You know, a day will come, and staff, I'm done with the political conversation. Do what you will do and see what happens.
We'll do the people's business, is all I'm saying.
Commissioner Simpson.
I was only going to say, we don't have a motion on the floor, so I can't call the question, but speaking of people's business, can we move on and do that?
Yes. I don't have my sheet. If, just adjourn this one. Okay. If nothing else, I'll make a motion to adjourn this part of the meeting. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Board of Commissioners advertised for Thursday, May 19th at 11 a.m. The purpose of this meeting is for the board to consider taking action concerning the acquisition of real property for any lawful purpose and including acquisition of property through the process of condemnation, which property may include that parcel identified on Union County tax map as 08-264-008, 3308 Ridge Road, Indian Trail, North Carolina, owned by Lucas Lands LLC. And now make a move that the Board of Commissioners go into closed session in accordance with General Statute 143-318-11A3 to consult with an attorney in order to preserve the attorney-client privilege. All in favor? Aye. The Board of Commissioners go into closed session for the following purposes. In accordance with General Statute 143-318.11A3 to consult with an attorney in order to preserve the attorney-client privilege, and B, in accordance with General Statute 143-318-1A5 to establish or to instruct the public body staff or negotiating agents concerning the position to be taken by or on behalf of the public body in negotiating the price and other material terms of a contract or proposed contract for the acquisition of real property in connection with property owned by Lucas Lands LLC and described in deed, recorded in deed book 7897, page 654 of the Union County Registry, identified as tax parcel number 08-264-008 for the possible use for the construction of a wastewater reclamation facility, sewer plant. All in favor? Aye. that we delay this matter of condemnation for 2 weeks while legal counsel does some more negotiations. All in favor of that motion? Aye. All in favor? I make a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Aye.